This next session involves 100% of Baylor University's distinguished professors of literature and the humanities. Our supply of such critters has doubled recently with the addition of Dr. Alan Jacobs. Both Dr. Jeffery and Dr. Jacobs are people whose names, when they appear in Books and Culture or First Things, that's going to the top of the stack. And so what we have in our midst and are so privileged to have at Baylor are two of the top leading public intellectuals Orthodox Christianity in the United States, in the West, in fact, in the Anglophone world, has to offer. If you are not a subscriber to Books and Culture or to First Things, I heartily recommend those journals to you. They're great journals of ideas for forward-thinking, Orthodox-minded Christians who want to be engaged with literature and the arts, and Baylor is quickly becoming a center of focus for such activity. I want you to, this is Dr. Jacobs, this is his first year with us, and so I want you to give him a very warm Baylor welcome.
Thanks, Trent, and thanks everybody for coming out on this delightful northern Illinois afternoon. I feel like I'm back in Wheaton again. So let's remind ourselves of where we are by taking a look at the dreaming spires of Baylor University. Oh, I'm sorry, it's a mistake there. I believe that is actually Oxford University. And those are the famous dreaming spires, or the second most famous dreaming spires, as seen from the University Church of St. Mary the Virgin, the church where John Henry Newman was rector in the 19th century. Here is an image of it as it might have appeared not long before C.S. Lewis arrived as an undergraduate, though by the time he got there, the curse of the motor car, as he and Tolkien referred to it, had come to Oxford. If you, in fact, you look on the left side of the screen there, you'll see just a little corner of University College, which is the college where Lewis was an undergraduate. In 1939, when war came to Europe for the second time in the 20th century, Lewis was asked to give a sermon at the University Church. He did this on a number of occasions over the years. The most famous of his sermons given there is the one called The Weight of Glory. But this one, called On Learning in Wartime, was one that he gave just as people were trying to adapt to the new circumstances of war. It was still peaceful in Oxford. Oxford would not be the direct target of Nazi bombing, in large part because when Hitler took over England, when he conquered England as he planned to do, he planned to make Oxford his capital. And so he did not wish to see Oxford damaged, and so it was left a pretty peaceful place, which means that many others were evacuated there, including some children whom Lewis watched over for the course of the war, and a man named Charles Williams, who was evacuated from Oxford University Press in London to the Oxford branch, and that was when Williams became a central part of the life of the Inklings there. As is perfectly natural, students there, knowing that at any moment they might find themselves called up to fight in the war, or perhaps those also who for one reason or another were not eligible to fight, either by reasons of health or by disinclination or by nationality. Whoever they were asking themselves, why are we bothering to learn? What is the point of learning in wartime? It seems utterly frivolous activity to master my Latin declensions and study ancient history and read PPE when there are people dying just across the English Channel. And so Lewis set out to make a defense of learning in wartime, and his defense was a very interesting one. It was essentially this: there is no difference to be stated between the case for learning when it is wartime and when it is not wartime. The conclusion of his essay goes as follows. I've put the last few sentences up here on the next 3 slides. What does war do to death? It certainly does not make it more frequent. 100% of us die, and the percentage cannot be increased. It puts several deaths earlier, but I hardly suppose that that is what we fear. Certainly when the moment comes, it will make little difference how many years we have behind us. Does it increase our chance of a painful death? I doubt it. As far as I can find out, what we call natural death is usually preceded by suffering, and a battlefield is one of the very few places where one has a reasonable prospect of dying with no pain at all, something which almost happened to Lewis himself, as he was seriously injured by a misplaced English shell in 1917. He did survive, but he could very easily have been killed, as was the man who was standing immediately next to him when that shell exploded. Does it decrease our chances of dying at peace with God? I cannot believe it. If active service does not persuade a man to prepare for death, what conceivable concatenation of circumstance would? Yet war does do something to death. It forces us to remember it. The only reason why the cancer at 60 or the paralysis at 75 do not bother us is that we forget them. All the animal life in us, all schemes of happiness that centered in this world were always doomed to a final frustration. In ordinary times, only a wise man can realize it. Now, the stupidest of us know. We see unmistakably the sort of universe in which we have all along been living and must come to terms with it. If we had foolish, unchristian hopes about human culture, they are now shattered. If we thought we were building up a heaven on earth, if we looked for something that would turn the present world from a place of pilgrimage into a permanent city, satisfying the soul of man, we are disillusioned and not a moment too soon. But if we thought that for some souls, and at some times, the life of learning, humbly offered to God, was in its own small way one of the appointed approaches to the divine reality and the divine beauty which we can hope to enjoy hereafter, we can think so still. This was Lewis speaking in peaceful Oxford. Not everywhere in England was it quite so peaceful. Here is the miraculous survival of St. Paul's when almost everything around it was destroyed. Here are the fires at night, the bombings, consequences. This is the environment in which T.S. Eliot, for instance, was an air raid warden and made his march through the night. Here are the people who are hiding in the underground at night, one place where they were almost absolutely certain to be safe. You may remember this is the environment that the Pevensey children were rescued from and then taken to their place, their uncle's place in the countryside. You may also be aware that this environment was, it seems to me to be the setting of the Screwtape Letters. The general suggestion of it is that it takes place in London. Of course, there were people who did still pursue learning in wartime. Here are the people in the ruins of the Duke of Marlborough House Library, having a delightful time looking through the ruins, but for most people there were few such moments of peace. Screwtape reminds Wormwood of this situation. He says, in terms that are strikingly like those that Lewis himself used in learning in wartime, I must warn you not to hope too much from a war. Of course a war is entertaining. The immediate fear and suffering of the humans is a legitimate and pleasing refreshment for our myriads of toiling workers. But what permanent good does it do us unless we make use of it for bringing souls to our Father below? And how disastrous for us is the continual remembrance of death which war enforces. One of our best weapons, contented worldliness, is rendered useless. In wartime, not even a human can believe that he is going to live forever. And so the human becomes increasingly aware in time of war of something which is always and everywhere true, something which the war does not alter in the least, but which it brings to our attention, and that is that our paths are forking, that again and again and again we must make consequential choices. And it's this idea of war as an opportunity for noticing the forking of the paths that I want to call attention to, because I think Lewis treats this in a very significant way. I want to contrast Lewis in this respect to the great Argentine novelist or short story writer and essayist Jorge Luis Borges. Borges published in the same year that the Screwtape Letters was published. He published a beautiful little story called The Garden of Forking Paths, a story in which a man believes that another man has created both a book and a labyrinth, only to discover, as he speaks to a relative of this man, that the book and the labyrinth were one and the same. He creates in this way, one of the characters says, diverse futures, diverse times, which themselves also proliferate and fork. Here, then, is the explanation of the novel's contradictions. Fang, let us say, has a secret. A stranger calls at his door. Fang resolves to kill him. Naturally, there are several possible outcomes. Fang can kill the intruder can kill Fang, they both can escape, they both can die, and so forth. In the work of Zui Pen, all possible outcomes occur. Each one is the point of departure for other forkings. Sometimes the paths of this labyrinth converge. For example, you arrive at this house, but in one of the possible paths, you are my enemy. In another, my friend. It's an image of what would later come to be called by modern physicists the multiverse, right? The idea of there being an infinite number of overlapping universes or parallel universes, in one of which I take this particular choice, in the next of which I take a different choice, in the third of which I take yet another choice. It has the curious effect of diminishing the significance of any of our choices, because somewhere in a universe next door or two doors over, I'm making different ones and living with different consequences and experiencing a whole different life, perhaps. It is this notion of forking paths, paths that fork into different universes, that Lewis wants to call attention to, but in a very different way. For Lewis, the paths do indeed fork, but they fork within the same universe. And they create paths which we then must reckon with without being able to retrace them. Consider this in response to this multiverse hypothesis, the story that we see in a book that Lewis wrote in the midst of the war, That Hideous Strength. A book which, though written in the midst of the war, is deliberately set in a period immediately after the war. That is, the point is, what choices are we going to be facing once the current conflict is over? Once the choices it demands are no longer in front of us, will there not be others that are perhaps equally momentous? And near the beginning of the story, Lewis sort of lifts up above his story and says, an observer placed at the right altitude above Edgestowe that night might have seen far to the south a moving spot on a main road, and later to the east, much nearer the silver thread of the wind and much more slowly moving, the smoke of a train. Mark Studdock in a car going to the headquarters of NICE, the National Institute of Coordinated Experiments, and then his wife Jane taking a train to the village of St. Anne's, or the house called St. Anne's, where she will meet a very different group of people, and where both of them, each of them is going to a place where he or she will be confronted with dramatically different choices and enormously consequential ones, just as consequential as the kinds of choices that you might make in the midst of an actual literal war, or what we usually call war. One of the characters in the book, kind of a liberal clergyman, says, as you chaps know, I make no claim to orthodoxy, but if religion is understood in the deepest sense, I have no hesitation in saying that Curry, by bringing the NICE to Edgestowe, has done more for it in 1 year than Jewell has done in his whole life. Well, said Curry modestly, that's rather the sort of thing one had hoped. I mightn't put it exactly as you do, James. No, no, said the bursar, of course not. We all have our different languages, but we all really mean the same thing. It is precisely this idea that Lewis most passionately wants to show the falseness of. I often wonder, said Dr. Dimble, whether Merlin doesn't represent the last trace of something the later tradition has quite forgotten about, something that became impossible when the only people in touch with the supernatural were either white or black, either priests or sorcerers. Have you ever noticed, said Dimble, that the universe and every little bit of the universe is always hardening and narrowing and coming to a point? His wife waited, as those wait who know by long experience the mental processes of the person who is talking to them. "I mean this," said Dimble in answer to the question she had not asked. If you dip into any college or school or parish or family, anything you like, at a given point in its history, you always find that there was a time before that point when there was more elbow room and contrasts weren't quite so sharp, and that there's going to be a time after that point when there is even less room for indecision and choices are even more momentous. Good is always getting better and bad is always getting worse. The possibilities of even apparent neutrality are always diminishing. The whole thing is sorting itself out all the time, coming to a point, getting sharper and harder, even apparent neutrality. The suggestion there is that neutrality was never more than apparent, but now even the apparent neutrality is ceasing to become an option. That is, we're talking about a world after the war in which the choices are, if anything, more momentous, the decisions more significant, the paths forking into more dramatically distinct directions. How might you be equipped, or how might you fail to be equipped to meet the challenge of these momentous choices? The really interesting thing about Mark Studdock in That Hideous Strength is that he is not at all prepared. And this is where we come back to, perhaps unexpectedly, to the idea of learning in wartime. Because Mark, whether he knows it or not, is in a war. He wishes to maintain neutrality. He cannot. He is pressed harder and harder to make a choice, and his education has equipped him with nothing that would enable him to make such a choice with wisdom or discernment. It must be remembered, Lewis writes, and this is Lewis extending, making sure that the hand of compassion is extended to Mark. Mark is a kind of a fumbling idiot in many ways, but Lewis is asking the question, could he be anything else? And I don't think you can stress too much the importance of this book being almost simultaneous with The Abolition of Man, which Dr. Beckwith talked about at lunchtime. In Abolition of Man, where Lewis speaks of men without chests, that is, people who do not have a moral formation. This is Mark. It must be remembered that in Mark's mind, hardly one rag of noble thought, either Christian or pagan, had a secure lodging. His education had neither been scientific nor classical, merely modern. The severities both of abstraction and of high human tradition had passed him by, excuse me, that's an error, and he had neither peasant shrewdness nor aristocratic honor to help him. He was a man of straw, a glib examinee in subjects that require no exact knowledge. Let's look at another book of the period, The Great Divorce. But in some sense or another, Lewis writes in his preface to the book, the attempt to make the marriage of heaven and hell, he quotes Blake, is perennial. The attempt is based on the belief that reality never presents us with an absolutely unavoidable either-or, that granted skill and patience, and above all, time enough, some way of embracing both alternatives can always be found, that mere development or adjustment or refinement will somehow turn evil into good without our being called on for a final and total rejection of anything we should like to retain. This belief I take to be a disastrous error. And it is in this belief that Mark Studdock was educated insofar as he was educated at all. That there's no need to make absolute and final choices, that somehow, with a degree of cleverness and glibness, you can navigate among the various alternatives, never really having to choose one, never really having to reject one, but instead just continually smoothing your path with the oil of your own cleverness. You cannot take all luggage with you on all journeys, as Lewis continues. On one journey, even your right hand and your right eye may be among the things you have to leave behind. We are not living in a world where all roads are radii of a circle and where all, if followed long enough, will therefore draw gradually nearer and finally meet in the center. Rather, in a world where every road, after a few miles, forks into two, and each of those into two again, and at each fork you must make a decision. Yes, the garden of forking paths, but not paths that create more and more and more possibilities. Rather, what's happening is that every choice, at every fork, you choose one and you close off another one. This is what the economists call opportunity costs, right? That is, you cannot maintain the opportunity for one while choosing the other. At every fork, your decision becomes more decisive. It is still either or. If we insist on keeping hell or even earth, we shall not see heaven. If we accept heaven, we shall not be able to retain even the smallest and most intimate souvenirs of hell. In hell, or what Lewis says, you are essentially in hell if you are trying to make choices in a certain way. Our narrator in The Great Divorce is told by someone who knows about this gray city. They've been moving on, getting further apart. They're so far off by now that they could never think of coming to the bus stop at all, astronomical distances. There's a bit of rising ground near where I live, and a chap has a telescope. You can see the lights of the inhabited houses where those old ones live millions of miles away. Millions of miles from us and from one another. Every now and then they move further still. That's one of the disappointments. I thought you'd meet interesting historical characters, but you don't. They're too far away. They've taken decisions which have isolated them more and more completely. Their love of their own autonomy has taken them completely out of contact with other human beings who might interfere with that autonomy. Now, let's contrast that image to an image from the last battle. It was the unicorn who summed up what everyone was feeling. He stamped his right forehoof on the ground and neighed and then cried, "I have come home at last. This is my real country. I belong here. This is the land I have been looking for all my life, though I never knew it till now." The reason why we love the old Narnia is that it sometimes looked a little like this. I'm thinking this is actually relevant to the question we were debating in the previous session about cryptic statements. Statements which are cryptic at a particular point in time because you simply do not have the knowledge or the experience that would be required in order to make sense of them. That was the point of my question, right? Is that are there some situations that you're in where you cannot be communicated with except in a cryptic way because you lack the empirical or the cognitive equipment to be able to understand what is being said to you? Now it's starting to make sense. Come further up, come further in. The paths fork and fork and fork. And one way takes you to ultimate isolation. The other way takes you to the ultimate in community, in personal and interpersonal wholeness, communion and fellowship with God and with one another. These are the forking paths that Lewis is interested in describing. And the whole question of learning in wartime is really, for Lewis, the question, how can we be equipped to make these choices wisely? What sort of intellectual, personal, religious, moral equipment is necessary in order for us to face a fork in the road and choose wisely, to choose with discernment? We're either getting further apart or further up and further in. These are where the paths fork. Either getting further apart or further up and further in, and the choices are becoming ever more momentous because at the end of the day, it's always wartime. Thank you.
Otherwise, we'll just let them go till 10 to the hour and sit in on their conversation, and then you're welcome to come up during the break and follow up.
I want to say that it's just a tremendous source of pleasure to me to be in a university which has Alan Jacobs as a professor. I've watched his career now since he was a fresh young PhD out of the University of Virginia, and I've observed the kind and quality of his mind with admiration for a very long time. So for him to be a distinguished professor and down the hall from myself, an almost extinguished professor, is a kind of benediction, and I want to say that. I really enjoyed the talk that Alan has prepared for you today, because I think in a way what he's telling us about Lewis's view on learning in wartime has an application for us in our environment today. I want to stress two kinds of application. The first has to do with the quality of the Christian life at any time and any place, which he was getting at. I think of a statement attributed to St. Augustine, who was at the time the Vandals were besieging Hippo. He was lecturing on the book of Isaiah, and one of his students is reported to have asked him, because they were being surrounded, they were cut off from water and food and so on, why are we still studying when demise is imminent? And Augustine's answer was, for the Christian, we must work as though we were going to live forever, and we must live as though we were going to die tomorrow. And I think that's a qualitative judgment about the nature of the Christian life. Luther has something like it. It's a little less elegant, but nevertheless, let me quote it. He was asked one time if he knew for sure that the Lord was returning that night, what would he do? And he said, I would go out and plant a tree. That kind of affirmation of creation and the good of relating to creation is, it seems to be, an intrinsic character of the mature Christian life. Lewis has a little essay called Of Good Work and Good Works, in which he stresses this kind of qualitative distinction. And what he wants to say is, you know, what we ought to be doing when we're confronted by what appear to be urgent matters is not torquing up our speed, not, you know, pumping out good works necessarily, but by making that work which we're called to do as good as we can make it. He was speaking to artists in that case, and the essay was first published in the Catholic Arts Quarterly in about 1959, I think, and it's reprinted in some of his essays. But the principle is a consistent one in Lewis, and I think it ties Lewis as a mature Christian back to these figures in the past. And it tells us, therefore, something about a qualitative approach to the Christian life, which is not going to be knocked off its pins by what appears to be a public urgency or crisis. So that's the first point, and these things jump into mind because of learning in wartime as an essay. The second point I want to make is that you know, Lewis is one of those people you read, like any really worthwhile author, who forces you to rethink your own time. Not to sort of get a perspective on what it was like to be in the time of your father while London was being bombed, but rather to think about America now, Baylor now, you know, education in America now. And the question that comes to my mind is, are we at war? And so let me venture a few speculative judgments about this, well, opinions. What some of our colleagues call the culture war, C.S. Lewis seems to have thought was more or less lost by the 1960s. That is, he thought that there was very little likelihood that Christians were going to turn the mainstream of culture around. And so what he thought we ought to do was something else. And he wasn't being a defeatist any more than Tolkien was at the very end of The Lord of the Rings. That's not defeatism. It's rather a realistic resignation to the obligation to bear witness even when you don't know what the outcome is going to be, and especially when you don't know what the political outcome is going to be. And so what I would say summarizes Lewis's view on this, and it ties so nicely into what Dr. Jacobs was doing, is he says, if I can put it in biblical language, we ought to be giving ourselves to strengthen what remains. That's in the immediate context of our vocation. And for him, that means education. So here's the point where I think it touches on what most of us have to do with. For Lewis, it was a remarkably prescient philosopher of education. I think you'd agree with that. I mean, he saw quite clearly where we were going, and that's what's going on in the abolition of man as well. But he has several ways of describing who we are now. Bulverism is one of them. And what bulverism is for Lewis, and he has an essay on this, it means That's Jeffrey, the Scots-Canadian talking, and you can expect him to have prejudices. And so you dismiss any rational argument I'm going to make because you know ahead of time what those prejudices are going to be, right? We do a lot of that in America. We say things like this: I'm an atheist, and you are intellectually challenged. We say things like, I'm a liberal, and you're obviously morally challenged. We say things like that, and people who say them want thereby to dismiss the space for rational argument. And so it can easily degenerate into something much worse than my two specious examples, right? It can become a form of enculturated or acculturated dismissal of the other and a refusal to listen in a charitable way, which is the first obligation of a Christian in any culture, is to listen in a charitable way and then engage, and to hope that engagement comes back. So for Lewis, what education needed to do was to get over those kinds of things. Leveling, he talks about this in Screwtape Letters. There's just a wonderful passage, which I hope you'll permit me to read just a few lines of, about the purpose of education. And he says this, he says, schoolmasters in our time are fighting hard in defense of education against vocational training. Universities, on the other hand, are fighting against education on behalf of what they call learning. Plus ça change, plus que la même chose. Trust us, right? He says, if education is beaten by training, civilization dies. That's a very strong view. And you know, from the adversary's point of view, Lewis didn't think we were in a battle. He thought there was a real adversary. His name is Satanas. You know, that's the adversary, and the Christian is in a battle unavoidably as long as the adversary is not permanently, finally, forever defeated on the last day. So there's no escaping the battle. And for Lewis, as an educator, as a professor, as a person who thought that the benefit of Christian education ought to be available to as many people as possible, and who had the will to work to get it, that's the battleground that was most evident to him. And, and so he develops these ideas about vocational training as an eclipse of the commitment of learning, liberal learning, that wants people to learn to think and choose wisely as a goal of education, and to replace that by a certain collection of information. And what he thinks is that that sort of emphasis, you know, you collect information and you acquire a certain skill set instead of learning to think and to choose, he says, that may look to you like it's opening up your capacity to choose this and that and the other thing. You may think you're in a very liberal environment, but actually what's happening is your real agency is being diminished all the while. So, diminishment of the value of wisdom is another one of his concerns. The idea that Lewis has that a long obedience in the same direction is so powerful in his work. He has an essay called The Transmission of Christianity. And what he wants to say is that we have to recognize that Christianity is a traditio, it's a handing down. We didn't invent it, we're not socially constructing it, we're trying to make the best out of what's been given to us as it has come to us, and then to evaluate that, think about that, try to decide how to apply it. And in this essay called On the Transmission of Christianity, which is in God in the Dock, he begins by talking about the war and how when you come back from a war, you see things in a little different way. And he says this: no generation can bequeath to a successor what it has not got. He's really reflecting Aquinas there. Nemo dat quod non habet. You can't give what you don't have. And he sets out here a critique really of Christianity as failing to harvest its own rich resources. And so it's not passing on the authentic thing. Not in terms of the life of the mind, not in terms of the life of the spirit. That's a serious criticism about how we're not fighting the battle well. And so he thinks that we can't escape. We're not going to be able to run off to an island in the Scottish, Hebrides or something like that and wait this out. This is our battle to fight. And if we choose to abandon the best weapons we have, and the best examples of how to fight this war for the sake of things which are of abiding value, not political value, abiding truth, not transient truth, then we have been very, very badly mistaken. He also thinks, and he says in this essay, that one of the ways in which the adversary manifests himself in this battle is in statism. So I just want to read one brief paragraph. See what you think about whether it's pertinent. Where the tide flows toward increasing state control, Christianity, with its claims in one way personal and in the other way ecumenical and both ways antithetical to omnicompetent government, must always, in fact, though not for a long time yet in words, be treated by the government as an enemy. Like learning, like the family, like any ancient and liberal profession, like the common law, it gives the individual a standing ground against the state, the it being Christianity. Why? Because it's not political. And when we make Christianity primarily a political force, I think on Lewis's reading at least, we even, in a sense, nullified some of its characteristic virtue to help us in the battle we're always facing. Thank you.
How are we doing? Okay, we've got a few minutes then, so questions, comments, catcalls from the audience? We're here for you. Ralph, Professor Wood.
How are these crucial life consequential decisions made for Lewis? Are they made in solitude of the individual's own interiority?
Right.
Or are they made by way of the individual's life and community?
Yeah.
How are they made?
Yeah. The question is, for Lewis, how are these decisions made? How are these life-transforming decisions made? And the answer, I think, is in many different ways. We can say, let's take That Hideous Strength, again, as an example, right, is that Jane, who is, I think, very interestingly, the one character in all of Lewis's fiction who most closely resembles him. She does not wish to have to make a decision. She just wants to be left alone. This was Lewis's constant refrain. Just leave me alone. Don't force me to choose. And whatever you do, do not force me to belong. That's the last thing in the world that he ever wanted to do. Jane is actually enabled to make decisions by even a brief period of formation within a strong and healthy community of like-minded people. And these people are shaped and formed by mutual service. And because their model is of mutual service, she imbibes enough of that to be able to make the decisions that she needs to make, even though her choices up until that point have been woefully, her education up until that point has been woefully inadequate. Her husband, Mark, is actually in even worse situation. Like Jane, he has no history, no formal education, no training within the family or within the church that would help him, and he is not in a supportive, nurturing, healthy community. Instead, he's completely isolated from other people. He's cut off. All that he has going for him maybe are two things. First of all, the one brief example of a man, Bill Hengist, a chemist, who resists the powers of NICE and pays for it with his life. He hasn't seen what happened to Hengist, but he did see him resist. He did see him say no. And then there was simply the fact that evil overstepped itself. Evil overstepped itself, and he saw it for what it was. It failed to disguise itself well enough, and he saw it for what it was. What both of these situations, both Jane and Mark, suggest is that even people who have almost no healthy and proper formation within a functioning tradition can nevertheless be the recipients of extraordinary grace. But what Lewis is, I think, at the bottom saying is that though, thanks be to God, he is indeed gracious to those of us who don't have many of those resources, that's not the way it should be. People shouldn't be in that situation. They should be shaped and formed within, as you were saying this morning, a tradition of moral understanding, a tradition of spiritual understanding, but also one that has a healthy local communal embodiment, which is what you have at St. Anne's. That's how it's supposed to be made. That's ideally how it happens, but of course it often doesn't.
Quick follow-up.
Yes.
Then how can bad decisions be reversed? You were saying we're all on these two trajectories taking us ever further apart. Can one do an about-face, which is to say, can one be converted?
I think that's. I think there's a word for that. Metanoia, I think, is is a word for that, right? I mean, there is forgiveness, there is repentance, and there is forgiveness, which of course we are all desperately need because we all make the wrong choices. But it is. I think it is the fact that I think what Lewis is trying to show in Mark Studicus is sometimes you can go so far that you are barely reachable, but nevertheless reachable. But that's because of extraordinary grace. David, would you like to?
Well, I think that's a really adequate answer for what Lewis is saying. It does cover the waterfront. There's another thing about community I would add to this, Ralph. Lewis's notion of community is one which is more liberal than is the case for many of us who are academics. In that novel, that Hideous Strength, one of the most crucial people is a minor player, Mrs. Dimble. Mrs. Dimble is enormously instrumental to what's going on in Jane. Right. And without Mrs. Dimble, this is your classic little old lady in tennis shoes, maybe it doesn't happen for Jane. It's sort of like in the Narnia books, if you don't have those little beavers and people like that, Mrs. Beaver, maybe it doesn't come off in quite the same way. Lewis has an appreciation for that, which I think is magnificent, and it's an antidote to what may be for some of us a narrower construal of community sometimes.
Is that Professor Moore back there? Yes, it is.
Alan, part of what enables Mark to recognize that evil has overstepped itself is by his own conversion to or turning to what he calls the normal.
Right.
I mean, 70 years since the publication of that book in the world that we're living in now, are we increasingly losing the possibility of being able to identify a normal by which the kind of recognition of evil might overstepping itself?
Yeah, so Professor Moore's question is, one of the things that happens to Mark in that Hideous Strength is that he gets this kind of almost like a vision of the normal versus the twisted, the normal versus the that which is bent, and he chooses the normal. And the question is, is that a choice that is still sort of culturally available? Has the idea of the normal been so deconstructed or so marginalized that it could no longer serve? I mean, that's a great question. I'm inclined to say no, in part because I would share with. I'm thinking about Professor Beckwith earlier mentioning Jay Budiszewski's idea of what you can't not know. There are things that we can't not know. And I do think that there is, at least for almost all of us, a kind of wiring, a kind of orientation that helps to make that kind of decision. And I think Lewis wants to present Mark Studicus as someone who is about as uninstructed in these matters as it's possible to be. But he does have one tiny little bit of knowledge about Jesus that seems to help. But that's about all he's got. So
I want to exercise the prerogative of the chair to ask a final closing question, one that focuses things very narrowly and locally. What is going on at Baylor to forward these strategies we find in Lewis?
I've only been here about 3 months. I don't know anything, so.
Oh, wasn't that slick?
You came here for a reason.
I did. I'm going to let him answer first.
What I think is going on at Baylor is a recognition that you cannot create a meaningful form of discipleship, a meaningful form of life which can be called Christian, except by pooling the resources of those who are disposed to learn and to teach and to give their lives to that so that the entire community can benefit from that. Baylor has an idea of its role historically, which is, I think, really interesting. It would have been at one time put in this way. This is the largest Baptist university in the world. It's a kind of guardian of Baptist culture. But one of the things that's true of Baylor now, and that maybe wasn't so true even in our recent past, is that we now think of ourselves as having a greater responsibility. We have a responsibility to Christian culture more broadly conceived, and not just Christian culture in the state of Texas or even in the United States, but in the world. So one of the things that we've been doing is we've been bringing in faculty and students from a much wider range of backgrounds. We've been engaging churches from a wider range of denominations. We've been thinking about what Don Schmeldikoff, my predecessor in the provost's office, called big tent orthodoxy as the kind of model that makes most sense for the relationship of the gospel to the world. And we haven't imagined that the university solves all the problems. It surely can't. But we have imagined that the university has particular resources which can be given to the church and given to those disposed to receive it. Whether they receive it as a student who in one class gets some kind of an insight into the kind of thing that Alan was attributing to Mark Studdick, this little bit of knowledge, or whether it's a formation which more broadly helps them to really think like a Christian. That is, to think in the terms of the qualitative, to put it in Lewis's terms, rather than the merely quantitative, to think less in terms of saving the culture than to be found faithful when the Lord makes his judgment. That's what I'd say is happening.
I can't say anything that good, I don't think, but I will say this. Trent, so why did you come here, right? I believe that the resources, the deep, rich resources of the broad tradition of Christianity, East and West, for 2,000 years, I believe that those resources do not foreclose intellectual possibilities, but enable intellectual possibilities. I came to Baylor because I think people here believe that too. And that this is a place in which people are, I think, generally saying to me and I think to others, you want to take advantage of the richness of that tradition in order to pursue serious intellectual inquiry and take major intellectual risks. Let's go for it.